On September 30th, 1886, the town of Elkhorn Creek drove two orphan sisters into the mountains to die. 4 months later, those same people would kneel at the entrance of a stone chamber, begging to be let inside. This is the story of Cora and Wren Whitfield. And if you have ever been punished for telling a truth that others did not want to hear, this story is for you. The morning air carried the first bite of autumn when Cora Whitfield stepped into Orville Tate's general store. She was 19 years old, tall and lean from mountain living, with dark hair pulled back in a practical braid and eyes the color of storm clouds. Her younger sister Wren followed close behind, 17 and softer in her features, with their mother's gentle mouth and their father's watchful gaze. The store fell quiet when they entered. It always did. The Whitfield sisters had that effect on people, the way a wolf's presence silences a henhouse. Not because they were dangerous, but because they were different. Because they had been raised in the wild places where the Bitterroot Range touched the sky, and they carried that wildness with them like a scent that civilized folk could not wash away. Cora had not come to buy anything. She had come to deliver a warning. She walked to the center of the store, where 3 women were examining fabric and 2 men were discussing the price of winter feed. She waited until she had their attention, which took only a moment, because everyone always watched the Whitfield sisters, even when pretending not to. When she spoke, her voice was calm and clear, carrying the strange certainty that had always unnerved the adults of Elkhorn Creek. The beaver dams on the upper creek are higher than any I have ever seen, 6 feet instead of 3. The elk are moving down from the high country a full month early, and their coats are thicker than they should be in September. The woolly bear caterpillars are black all the way through, not a single brown stripe. My father saved 17 lives during the winter of 1879, Wren said quietly, unable to stay silent. He predicted the ice storm 3 days before it came. The families who listened to him survived. The families who did not, many of them did not survive. Reverend Crane turned his gaze upon the younger sister, and something cold moved behind his eyes. Something that looked almost like hunger. Your father is dead, child. Whatever gifts he imagined he possessed did not save him from the mountain that took his life. And now you stand here, 2 orphan girls without family or proper guardianship, spreading fear and confusion among good Christian folk. He turned to address the gathering crowd, because a crowd had gathered now, drawn by the raised voices and the promise of drama. I have hesitated to speak of this matter, but I fear I must. The Whitfield claim, those 200 acres on the North Ridge, has no clear legal ownership. Josiah Whitfield never properly filed his homestead papers. His daughters are not of legal age to inherit. The land by rights should return to the public trust. Or to the church, someone muttered, too quietly for the Reverend to identify the speaker. Cora understood then. She understood why Crane had opposed them at every turn since their father's death. Why he had preached against them from his pulpit. Why he had spread whispers about their mother's death and their father's strange ways. He wanted their land, the 200 acres of prime timber and clean water that Josiah Whitfield had claimed 20 years ago and worked every day of his life. The land where their mother was buried, the land where they had buried their father with their own hands, digging through frozen earth for 4 days until their fingers bled. Crane did not care about their souls. He cared about their property. He said they were superstitious fools who did not understand modern methods. She turned to face the congregation, and her voice grew stronger. 17 people died that winter. My husband's brother, my sister-in-law, their 3 children, frozen in their cabin because they did not prepare, because they did not listen, because they thought they knew better than the people who had been reading this land for generations. The church was silent. Even Reverend Crane seemed momentarily at a loss for words. These girls may be young, Delphine continued. They may be orphans. They may be strange and wild and different from us. But their father saved lives with his knowledge, and his father before him. When Josiah Whitfield told me to stock extra feed in 1879, I listened. My cattle survived when half the herds in the valley perished. When he told me to reinforce my roof in 1882, I listened. My cabin stood when others collapsed under the snow. She pointed a gnarled finger at Reverend Crane. And I noticed that you, Reverend, are very eager to claim land that has been in the Whitfield family for 20 years. land that happens to border your own property, land that includes the best timber stand and the cleanest spring in the entire valley. Crane's face flushed red. Perhaps you should remember, Widow Brennan, that your own position in this community is not so secure that you can afford to make accusations against men of God. The threat hung in the air like smoke. But Delphine Brennan had buried a husband and raised 4 children alone in a territory that killed the weak. She was not easily frightened. I remember what I remember, she said, and I will speak what I know to be true. These girls have done nothing wrong except try to help people who do not want to be helped. Aldrich Holloway rose to his feet then, his voice carrying the weight of his position and his years. I have lived in this valley for 35 years. I have seen hard winters and easy winters, and I know the difference. There is nothing unusual about this autumn. The signs these girls speak of are the imaginings of a dead man who spent too much time alone in the mountains. I will not be frightened by children's tales. Dr. Mercer nodded his agreement. Superstition is not science, he said. We are not primitive people who read the future in the entrails of animals. We are modern Americans with modern methods. I have consulted the almanacs and the weather reports from the territorial capital. There is no indication of an unusually severe winter. Clem Skaggs called out from the back of the church, his voice dripping with mockery. I will wager $5 that their cave collapses before Christmas. Who wants to take that bet? Tension-releasing laughter rippled through the congregation. The outcome had been decided before anyone spoke a word. Reverend Crane smiled the smile of a man who has won. It is the decision of this community, he announced, that the Whitfield property shall be held in trust by the church until proper ownership can be determined. The Whitfield sisters shall be provided with supplies sufficient for a journey to the territorial capital, where they may seek placement in appropriate institutions for young women without family. He paused, savoring the moment. They have until dawn to gather their personal effects and depart. Cora looked around the church at the faces of her neighbors. Some avoided her gaze. Others stared with the satisfied expressions of people who had solved a problem. A few, like Delphine Brennan and old Tobias Crow, the grizzled trapper who sat alone near the door, looked away with something like shame. She thought about arguing. She thought about fighting. She thought about all the things her father had taught her about standing for truth, even when truth was unwelcome. And the women of the town gossiped about the wild Whitfield sisters, agreeing that it was all for the best, really, that those strange girls were gone. No one prepared for winter. No one believed the signs. And high in the Bitterroot Range, the beaver continued building their dams higher than any human had ever seen, working with a desperate urgency that spoke of knowledge beyond words, beyond reason, beyond the arrogant certainty of civilized men who thought they understood the world. A small fire can heat a well-designed cave to comfortable temperatures using a fraction of the fuel required for a wooden cabin. She looked at her sister. We are going to carve a home into this mountain. We are going to make this crack into a room. And when the winter comes, we will be warm while everyone in Elhorn Creek freezes. Wren studied the rock face, her practical mind already calculating the work involved. How long do we have? Cora looked at the sky, at the trees, at the behavior of the birds and squirrels that moved through the valley. 6 weeks. Maybe 8, if we are lucky. The first snow will come early this year, but the killing cold will hold off until December. And if you are wrong, Cora met her sister's eyes. I am not wrong. Father was never wrong about the weather. His father was never wrong. This knowledge has been passed down through generations of men who survived winters that would kill everyone in Elhorn Creek twice over. She picked up a flat stone and began scraping at the sandstone wall, testing its hardness. We start today. We work every hour of daylight. We stop when the job is done or when we die trying. Wren watched her sister for a long moment. Then she picked up another stone and joined her at the rock face. We should name this place, she said. Cora considered this as she scraped at the sandstone. Stone Haven. Wren nodded. Stone Haven. I like that. It sounds like home. If you are enjoying this story, I would love for you to tap that subscribe button right now. It is free, takes just a moment, and it helps stories like this reach more people who need to hear them. Now let us see what the sisters built with nothing but their hands and their father's wisdom. The first week was the hardest work either of them had ever done. They used their father's knife, flat stones shaped into crude chisels, and a heavy river rock as a hammer. The sandstone was soft enough to work, but hard enough to be exhausting. Each day's labor removed another 4 to 6 inches of depth. Their hands blistered on the second day, bled on the fourth, and began forming calluses by the end of the week. They worked in shifts, one carving while the other gathered food and maintained their temporary camp. They caught rabbits in snares made from strips of rawhide. They collected rose hips and pine nuts, and the roots of the camas plant, which their father had taught them, was a staple food of the native peoples. They built a crude lean-to against the cliff face to shelter them while they worked. Hatchet proved invaluable. He ranged through the valley each day, his wolf heritage making him a natural hunter. He caught ground squirrels and rabbits, sometimes bringing them back to the sisters, sometimes eating them himself. At night he slept between them under the lean-to, his body heat helping to ward off the growing cold. By the end of the first week, the crack had widened into a passage 6 feet deep and 5 feet wide. Not enough to live in, but enough to shelter from a storm. And then disaster struck. On October 12th, as Cora worked at the deepest part of the excavation, a section of the ceiling gave way. Stone crashed down around her, and she threw herself backward, narrowly avoiding being crushed. But Wren, who had been working beside her, was not as quick. A slab of sandstone, perhaps 30 pounds, caught her left leg just below the knee. She screamed, a sound that echoed off the cliff walls and sent birds scattering from the nearby trees. When Cora pulled the stone away, she found a leg that was bruised and swelling rapidly, though thankfully not broken. "Can you walk?" Wren tried to stand and immediately collapsed, her face going white with pain. "No, I do not think so. Not for a while." Cora looked at the half-finished cave, at the supplies they had gathered, at the sky that seemed to grow grayer with each passing day. She calculated the time remaining, the work still to be done, the impossibility of doing it alone. Then she squared her shoulders and made a decision. "You will rest. I will work. When you can walk again, you will help. Until then, you prepare what you can from here. Make snares. Process the food. Keep the fire going." Wren's eyes filled with tears of frustration. "I am sorry. I should have been more careful." Cora knelt beside her sister and took her hand. Father broke his arm when he was building his first cabin. He finished it with one hand because there was no other choice. "We are his daughters. We will finish this because there is no other choice." Wren did not waste her recovery time. She sat propped against the cave wall, weaving snares from strips of rawhide, preparing dried herbs their father had taught them about, keeping the fire fed so Cora could work longer hours. She sang while she worked, old songs their mother had taught them, and the sound of her voice echoing off the stone walls kept Cora's spirits from breaking. That night, Hatchet lay beside Wren, his body pressed against her injured leg, keeping it warm. In the morning, the swelling had begun to go down. In a week, she could stand. In 10 days, she could help again. But for those 10 days, Cora worked alone. 16 hours a day, from first light until she could no longer lift her arms, she carved stone. She did not think about fairness or justice. She did not waste energy on anger at the people who had cast them out. She thought only of the winter that was coming and the home that was taking shape beneath her bleeding hands. Have you ever had to work through pain and exhaustion because failure was not an option? Have you ever pushed your body beyond what you thought possible because someone you loved was depending on you? Tell me about it in the comments. I would love to hear your story. By mid-October, the cave had grown to 10 feet deep, 8 feet wide, and 7 feet tall at its highest point. Wren was walking again, limping but determined, and the work progressed faster with both of them carving. They created a fire pit near the entrance, positioned so that smoke would rise naturally through a crack in the ceiling. They carved a storage alcove into one wall for food and supplies. They shaped the floor to be level and smooth, with a slight slope toward the entrance for drainage. The design came from their father's journal, refined by their own observations and the practical demands of the work. The deeper chamber would be their living space. The entrance area would serve as a workshop and transition zone. The natural overhang outside would provide shelter for firewood and other supplies that needed to stay dry. It was during the third week that Wren discovered the horses. She had been gathering rose hips in a meadow about a mile from the cave when she saw them. A small band of wild mustangs, perhaps a dozen animals, grazing in the autumn grass. Among them was a mare with a coat the color of dying embers, red gold like the sandstone of their new home. The mare was pregnant, very pregnant. Wren could see the swell of her belly even from a distance. She returned to the cave that evening and told Cora what she had seen. "If I could tame her," Wren said, her eyes bright with possibility, "if I could bring her here before she gives birth, we would have a horse for work and travel. The baby would grow up tame, and the body heat of 2 horses would help warm the cave." It was a risk. Taming a wild horse took time and patience, resources they could barely spare. But the potential benefit was enormous. Cora considered for a long moment, then nodded. "Do it. But not more than 2 hours each day away from the main work. We cannot slow our progress on the cave." Wren spent the next 8 days approaching the Mustang herd. She used the techniques their father had taught her, which he had learned from the Nez Perce horsemen who still lived in the high country. She did not chase or corner. She did not show aggression. She simply existed in the same space as the horses, moving slowly, speaking softly, offering handfuls of grass, and the patience that wild animals eventually came to trust. On the 6th day, the ember-colored mare approached her. On the 7th day, she ate from Wren's hand. On the 8th day, she followed Wren back to Stonehaven. They named her Ember. She was perhaps 6 years old, strong despite the pregnancy, and intelligent in the way that wild animals must be to survive. She accepted the sisters as part of her herd, and Hatchet as a strange but tolerable packmate, and the cave as shelter that was better than standing in the wind. Her foal came early, in the last week of November, just as the first serious snows began to fall. A filly with her mother's coloring, smaller than a domesticated foal, but fierce and determined. They named her Spark. By the end of November, the cave had reached its final dimensions. 16 feet deep, 14 feet wide, 8 feet high at the center, a main chamber large enough for living and working, a fire pit with a natural chimney that drew smoke upward through cracks in the stone, a storage alcove packed with dried rabbit meat, rose hips, pine nuts, camas roots, and other provisions. 2 cords of firewood stacked against the back wall, and a secondary chamber, smaller but adequate, where Ember and Spark sheltered from the weather. The door was the final piece. They built it from fallen aspen logs, lashed together with rawhide strips, fitted into a frame that Cora had carved into the stone entrance. They lined the inside with rabbit fur, creating an insulated barrier that could be sealed from within. When the door was closed and the fire lit, the cave maintained a temperature of 60 degrees, even when the outside air dropped below freezing. The stone walls absorbed heat during the day and released it at night. The horses added their body warmth to the space. The storm began like any other winter weather. Snow falling steadily through the morning hours, wind picking up toward noon, visibility decreasing as afternoon wore into evening. The people of Elhorn Creek went about their routines with the casual confidence of those who had survived many winters. By midnight, the routine had become a nightmare. The temperature, which had been hovering around 20 degrees above zero when the storm began, dropped 35 degrees in 3 hours. By dawn on December 10th, the thermometer outside Orville Tate's general store read 15 below zero. By noon, it read 25 below. By evening, it had dropped past 40 below and showed no signs of stopping. The wind increased with the cold. Gusts of 50 miles per hour drove the snow horizontally, creating drifts that buried fences and blocked doors within hours. The visibility dropped to zero. A man could not see his own hands stretched in front of his face. This was not a winter storm. This was the killing breath of an Arctic outbreak, a river of frozen air pouring down from the Canadian territories, with nothing to slow it down, nothing to moderate its fury. The Great Blizzard of 1886 had begun, and it would not end for 9 days. At Stonehaven, the storm announced itself with a sound that Cora had never heard before. A deep, constant roar, like a waterfall made of ice and wind. The wooden door vibrated in its frame, but held secure. A few drafts found their way through gaps in the construction, but the fire kept the main chamber warm and comfortable. They had prepared well. They had enough firewood for 90 days, stacked in the covered area outside and in an alcove just inside the entrance. They had food for 60 days, carefully rationed. They had water from the spring, which continued to flow even as the world outside froze solid. Inside the cave, the temperature remained constant at 52 degrees. With a small fire burning, it rose to the low 60s. Comfortable, survivable, safe. Ren read aloud from their father's journal while Cora tended the fire. Ember and Spark stood quietly in their chamber, occasionally nickering softly. Hatchet lay across the threshold of the main entrance, his body blocking drafts, his ears alert to every sound from outside. On the third night, Cora woke to find Hatchet's head resting on her chest, his amber eyes watching her face in the firelight. She stroked his gray fur and whispered words she had never said to another living soul. "I miss him too, boy. Every day." Hatchet's tail thumped once against the stone floor. He understood. He had lost his master too, and now they were keeping each other alive, the way family does. On the fourth day, the storm intensified. The temperature dropped to 52 below zero, the coldest Cora had ever experienced. At this temperature, exposed flesh could freeze in less than 5 minutes. Spit would freeze before it hit the ground. Metal became so brittle that tools could shatter from ordinary use. But inside the cave, the fire burned steadily, and the stone walls held their heat, and the Whitfield sisters survived. In Elhorn Creek, 20 miles to the south, the disaster unfolded exactly as Cora had predicted. The cattle began dying first. The ranchers who had laughed at the Whitfield sisters' warnings watched helplessly as their herds froze in the draws and coulees. The animals had no shelter adequate to survive temperatures this extreme. They huddled together seeking warmth, but there was no warmth to be found. They died standing up, their bodies freezing solid before they even fell. Aldrich Holloway, who owned the largest ranch in the valley, lost 200 head in the first 48 hours. By the end of the week, he would lose nearly 400, the work of a lifetime disappearing in a matter of days. The Mercer Ranch lost 150. The Skaggs homestead lost their entire herd of 30 dairy cows. The church's small cattle operation, which Reverend Crane had been so proud of, was wiped out completely. By the fourth day, people began to realize that the cattle were not the only things at risk. The homes of Elhorn Creek were typical frontier construction, wooden frames, single-wall design, heated by wood stoves that had to be constantly fed to maintain warmth. In an ordinary winter, they were adequate. In a winter like this, they were death traps. The problem was the wind. It found every crack, every gap, every imperfection in the construction. It stole heat faster than the stoves could produce it. Families that burned wood at their normal rate found their homes growing colder instead of warmer. Families that increased their burn rate found their wood piles disappearing with frightening speed. On the fifth day, the first roof collapsed. The Skaggs family home, where Clem lived with his parents and 2 younger sisters, had been built with a roof that was adequate for normal snow loads. But the snow from this storm was not normal. It accumulated without melting, piling layer upon layer, until the weight exceeded what the structure could bear. The family escaped with their lives, running through chest-deep drifts to the nearest neighbor. But their home was gone, along with most of their possessions, and they were now refugees in a community that was running out of resources to share. On the 6th day, the wood began to run out. Every family in Elhorn Creek had a wood pile. In an ordinary winter, these supplies were more than sufficient. But this winter was burning through fuel at 3 times the normal rate, and the storm showed no sign of ending, and no one could venture out to cut more wood without risking death by freezing. Orville Tate burned his store's wooden shelving on the 5th day. By the 7th day, he was burning furniture. The Ashford family, whose fine house was the largest in town, began dismantling their barn for fuel. And then, on December 16th, the first human death occurred. Old Tobias Crow had lived in Montana Territory longer than anyone could remember. He was 72 years old, tough as rawhide, a trapper who had survived more winters than he could count. He had known Josiah Whitfield well. He had believed the Whitfield sisters when they tried to warn the town. And when the storm came, he had nodded grimly and prepared as best he could. But even preparation has limits. His cabin was small, well-built, adequately stocked. He should have been able to wait out the storm. But on the morning of the 16th, he woke to find his fire dead and his wood box empty. Somehow in the night, he had used more than he realized. Somehow the cold had crept in. He needed to reach his woodpile, just 20 feet from his door. 20 feet, a distance he could walk in 10 seconds under normal circumstances. He put on every piece of clothing he owned. He wrapped his face in scarves until only his eyes showed. He opened the door. The cold hit him like a physical blow. The wind tore at his clothing, finding gaps he had not known existed. The snow was so thick that he could not see his woodpile, could not see anything except white. He stepped outside. He took 2 steps, 3, 4, and then he lost his way. In a whiteout, direction becomes meaningless. Up and down, left and right, forward and back, all become the same featureless void. Tobias Crow, who had navigated these mountains for 50 years, became disoriented within seconds of leaving his door. He died 20 feet from his cabin, 20 feet from warmth and safety and life. They found his body in the spring, when the snows melted, curled up in a snowdrift like a man who had simply laid down to sleep. He had been one of only 2 people in Elhorn Creek who had believed the Whitfield sisters. Now he was the first of many who would die. The storm has been raging for 8 days now. The temperature is 45 below zero. The fuel is running out. If you have ever lived through a winter that felt like it would never end, I would love to hear about it in the comments. What got you through? Now let us see what happens next. On December 17th, the roof of Dr. Edwin Mercer's house collapsed. Unlike the Skaggs' home, where the family had escaped unharmed, the doctor was trapped beneath the falling timbers. His left leg was broken in 2 places, compound fractures that in normal circumstances would require immediate surgery. But these were not normal circumstances. The doctor who needed help was the only doctor in town. The leg that needed surgery was impossible to operate on without assistance and equipment that did not exist. And even if they could have helped him, they could not have moved him through the storm to a place where help might be available. Edwin Mercer, the man of science who had dismissed the Whitfield sisters' warnings as superstition, spent the remaining days of the storm lying on a makeshift bed in his neighbor's house, his legs splinted but not set, his pain managed only by whiskey and prayer, his carefully constructed certainties crumbling around him. He was not expected to live. The fact that he did survive, though he would never walk without a limp again, was a miracle that he would spend the rest of his life trying to understand. By December 18th, the storm had been raging for 9 days. 33 people in and around Elhorn Creek had died. Some froze in their homes when the fuel ran out. Some died trying to reach neighbors or supplies. Some, like old Tobias Crow, simply lost their way in the white void and were swallowed by the cold. And Reverend Malcolm Crane had not left the church in 5 days. He had barricaded himself inside when the storm began, confident that God would protect his faithful servant. He had burned the pews first, then the choir risers, then the wooden baptismal font that had been shipped at great expense from St. Louis. He prayed constantly, his voice rising and falling in the empty sanctuary, alternating between pleas for mercy and angry demands that the storm end. But the storm did not end, and the church, like every other building in Elhorn Creek, was running out of fuel. On the morning of December 18th, Crane woke to find ice forming on the inside walls of the church. His fire had burned down to embers during the night. He had nothing left to burn except the pulpit and the cross. He burned them both. And when they were gone, he wrapped himself in the altar cloth and waited to see if God would provide. In the Holloway Ranch House, the largest and best-built home in the valley, the situation was growing desperate. Aldrich Holloway had prepared better than most. His woodpile was enormous, his house well-constructed, his provisions ample. He had expected to ride out the storm in relative comfort, but he had not expected the storm to last 9 days. He had not expected temperatures of 50 below zero. He had not expected his cattle, his life's work, to die by the hundreds while he watched helplessly from his windows. And he had not expected his youngest son, 8-year-old Benjamin, to develop a cough that would not stop. The child had been sick for 3 days now. Not seriously ill, not by normal standards, but in these conditions, normal standards did not apply. A cough that would have been minor in warm weather became dangerous when the air itself seemed to freeze in the lungs. A fever that would have passed in a few days could not be properly treated when the doctor was crippled and unreachable. Aldrich's wife, Catherine, held the boy constantly, wrapping him in blankets, keeping him near the stove, praying the prayers of a mother who has realized that she cannot protect her child from the forces arrayed against him. Thorne, their eldest son, paced the house like a caged animal. He had wanted to help the Whitfield sisters. He had wanted to speak up at the town meeting. He had wanted to be better than the fear that had kept him silent. Now he watched his little brother struggling to breathe and wondered if his silence had somehow contributed to this catastrophe. If speaking up would have changed anything. If there was still something he could do. On the evening of December 18th, Benjamin's fever spiked dangerously. He lay in his mother's arms, his lips turning blue, his small body racked with coughs that brought up blood. And Aldrich Holloway, the man who had dismissed the Whitfield sisters' warnings, who had helped drive them into the wilderness, who had declared with absolute confidence that he knew everything there was to know about Montana winters, finally admitted the truth. His voice broke as he spoke. Every word I said was arrogance. Every judgment I made was blindness. Catherine looked up at him, tears streaming down her face. What do we do? Aldrich was silent for a long moment. He thought about pride and about certainty, and about all the things he had believed that had turned out to be false. He thought about the two orphan girls he had helped condemn, and the knowledge they carried, and the possibility that they had survived when everyone else was dying. We find them, he said finally, the Whitfield sisters. If they are still alive, if they prepared the way they said they were preparing, they might be the only ones who can help us now. You do not even know where they went. Thorne stepped forward. His face was pale, but his voice was steady. I do, he said. I watched them leave. They went north toward the old Whitfield hunting grounds in the foothills. There are cliff formations there, sandstone caves. If they built what they said they were going to build, that is where they are. Aldrich looked at his son with an expression that mixed pride and shame. You knew? I suspected. I should have said something sooner. I should have helped them. Aldrich put a hand on his son's shoulder. We have all made mistakes. The question is what we do now. At dawn on December 19th, a party of 5 men left the Holloway Ranch and began walking north through the snow. This is the moment where everything changes. The moment where the people who judged and condemned must come face to face with the people they tried to destroy. If you have been waiting for vindication, it is coming. Stay with me. The journey should have taken 4 hours in normal conditions. In the aftermath of the storm, with snow drifts 10 feet deep in places and temperatures still hovering at 30 below zero, it took 12. One man turned back after 3 hours, his strength exhausted. Another collapsed halfway through and had to be carried. The remaining 4 pressed on, driven by desperation, guided by Thorne's memory of the direction the sisters had traveled. Aldrich Holloway had never known such cold. It penetrated through every layer of clothing, found every gap, every weakness. His beard froze solid. His eyelashes became crusted with ice that he had to constantly clear away. His fingers and toes went numb, then began to ache, then went numb again in a way that he knew meant frostbite. But he did not turn back. His son was dying. His community was dying. And somewhere in these mountains, if they were lucky, if the impossible had happened, 2 orphan girls might be alive. They found the smoke first, a thin gray line rising from a cliff face they had passed 100 times without noticing. The smoke was barely visible against the gray sky, but it was there, rising from a crack in the rock, proof of fire and warmth and life. Thorne saw the entrance next, a dark gap in the red-gold sandstone, sheltered beneath a natural overhang, almost invisible unless you knew what to look for. And in front of that gap, fitted so precisely into the rock that it seemed to have grown there, a wooden door. Aldrich's legs nearly gave out. After 12 hours of walking, after cold that should have killed him, after everything, there it was, a door in a cliff face. Proof that the girls he had tried to destroy had built something he could not have imagined. He stumbled forward through the last 50 feet of snow and raised his fist to knock. Before he could make contact, the door opened. Cora Whitfield stood in the entrance. She was thin from the rationing, but her color was good, her eyes clear, her posture straight. Behind her, warmth radiated outward like a physical force. The air that escaped from the cave was comfortable, almost balmy compared to the frozen hell outside. She looked at Aldrich Holloway, at the man who had stood in the church and declared that she and her sister knew nothing, at the man who had helped take their land, at the man who had sent them into the wilderness to die. And she waited for him to speak. Aldrich tried to form words. His frozen lips would not cooperate properly. His frozen mind struggled to organize the thoughts that tumbled through it. Finally, he managed to speak. I am sorry. We were wrong. Everything you said was true. Cora's expression did not change. Why are you here? Aldrich's voice broke. My son, Benjamin. He is 8 years old. He has a fever, a cough. He is dying. We have no medicine, no heat, no food. The town is dying. 33 people dead already. We have nowhere else to go. From behind Cora, Wren appeared. She looked at the frozen men standing in the snow, at the desperation in their faces, at the suffering that had been inflicted by their own pride and certainty. How many are left alive, she asked. Aldrich shook his head. I am not certain. 73 maybe. Fewer now, perhaps. There are 31 children. 31 children. The words hung in the air between them. Children who had no part in the decision to cast out the Whitfield sisters. Children who were suffering because of the arrogance of adults. Cora looked at Wren. A silent conversation passed between them, the kind that only exists between people who have shared everything. Then Cora stepped aside. Bring them, she said. Bring them all. Children first, then the sick, then the others. We have room enough if people are willing to share. We have food for 2 weeks if we ration carefully. The spring does not freeze. She paused and her voice hardened. But understand this. You are not our guests. You are survivors. You will follow our rules and our instructions. You will work and contribute. And when this is over, you will remember what happened here. You will remember what happens when you silence the people who try to warn you. Aldrich nodded. He would have agreed to anything at that moment. He would have signed over his ranch, his name, his life. Thank you, he said. Thank you. Cora looked at him with an expression closer to acceptance than forgiveness, though neither word quite fit. Do not thank me. Thank my father. He taught us that the mountain does not care about grudges. It only cares about who is prepared. He also taught us that surviving when others die is a choice to be better, not a chance to be cruel. She stepped back into the warmth of the cave. Bring them quickly. There is not much daylight left. The evacuation took 3 days. Cora and Thorn led the rescue parties, navigating paths through the snow that only Cora's knowledge of the terrain made possible. They found shelter along the way in smaller caves and rock formations that Cora had mapped during the autumn. They carried children who could not walk and supported adults who could barely stand. 68 people made it to Stonehaven. Some came willingly, grateful for any chance at survival. Others came reluctantly, ashamed to seek help from the girls they had condemned. A few refused to come at all. Reverend Malcolm Crane was among those who refused. I will not follow the daughters of a godless man, he declared when the rescue party found him in the church, wrapped in the frozen remnants of the altar cloth, his lips blue and his fingers blackening from frostbite. Reverend, Thorn said, his voice tight with frustration, if you stay here, you will die. Then I will die in God's house, serving God's purpose. I will not accept salvation from the hands of witches and heathens. Thorn looked at the man who had orchestrated the exile of the Whitfield sisters, the man who had wanted their land, the man who had wrapped his greed in the language of righteousness. Suit yourself, he said finally. I hope God appreciates your stubbornness more than I do. He left the Reverend alone in the frozen church. Crane died 3 days later. They found his body in the spring, frozen solid, still wrapped in the altar cloth, his hands clasped around a Bible that he had not had the sense to burn for warmth. Some said it was God's judgment. Others said it was simply stupidity. Either way, Reverend Malcolm Crane became a cautionary tale, a reminder that pride and certainty can kill as surely as any blizzard. Inside Stonehaven, a different kind of story was unfolding. 68 people crowded into a space designed for 2. It should have been impossible. It should have been chaos. Instead, it became a small miracle of cooperation and survival. Cora organized everything. She assigned sleeping areas based on family size and the presence of children. She established rationing protocols for the food supplies. She created work schedules so that someone was always tending the fire, always watching the door, always monitoring the sick. Wren handled the medical emergencies. She was no doctor, but she knew the herbs their father had taught them about. the treatments that had kept mountain people alive for generations. She made poultices for frostbitten fingers and toes. She brewed teas from dried rose hips to fight infection. She sat with the children through their fevers and sang the songs their mother had sung to them before she died. Benjamin Holloway, the boy whose illness had driven his father to seek out the Whitfield sisters, survived. It took a week, but the fever broke and the cough subsided, and on Christmas morning, he was well enough to sit up and eat solid food. His first words were a question. "Can I pet the dog?" Hatchet, who had spent the previous week guarding the entrance and growling at strangers, walked over to the boy and laid his massive head in Benjamin's lap. The boy's delighted laughter filled the cave, the first genuine laughter anyone had heard in weeks. It was Christmas in a cave in the mountains of Montana. There were no presents, no decorations, no feast. There was only warmth and survival and the slow, grudging building of something like community. Cora stood at the entrance, looking out at the snow that continued to fall. Behind her, she could hear Wren reading to the children from their father's journal, telling them stories about the animals and the land and the old ways of knowing. Thorn Holloway approached and stood beside her. "I wanted to help you," he said quietly. "At the town meeting, I wanted to speak up. I was too afraid." Cora did not look at him. "Fear is reasonable. Your father is a powerful man. Going against him would have cost you. It cost you more." "Yes, it did." They stood in silence for a long moment, watching the snow fall. "I could have warned you," Thorn said. "I could have come to help you before the storm. I knew where you had gone." "Yes." "You could have. You did not." "No, I did not." Cora finally turned to look at him. Her expression was unreadable. "What matters now is not what you did then. What matters now is what you do next. When this is over, when we return to what is left of the town, there will be choices to make, ways of thinking to change. Will you be part of that change, or will you fall back into the old patterns?" Thorn met her gaze. "I will be different, I swear it. Swearing is easy. Doing is hard. We will see." She turned back to the snow. "Now go get some rest. You are on fire watch in 4 hours, and you will need your strength." The storm finally broke on January 2nd, 1887. After 24 days of nearly continuous blizzard, the wind died, the clouds parted, and a weak winter sun appeared over mountains that had been transformed into an alien landscape of ice and snow. Cora unsealed the door and stepped outside for the first time in almost 2 weeks. The cold was still brutal, perhaps 25 below zero, but without the wind, it was survivable. The snow was 7 feet deep in the valley below, with drifts climbing much higher against the cliff faces. She stood there for a long time, breathing the frozen air, looking out at a world that had tried to kill them all. Behind her, the survivors began to emerge, blinking in the sudden brightness, marveling at the scale of the destruction, beginning the impossible task of comprehending what had happened and what it meant for the future. The return to Elhorn Creek took most of a day. The survivors walked in a long column through the snow, following the paths that Cora had memorized during the autumn. Children rode on the backs of adults. The injured were carried on improvised stretchers. Ember and Spark helped pull a sled loaded with the few supplies that remained. Hatchet ranged ahead of the group, his wolf senses alert for danger. But there was no danger. The wildlife that had survived the storm was hidden deep in dens and burrows, waiting for the world to warm enough for activity. The only sounds were the crunch of snow beneath feet and the occasional cough from those whose lungs had been damaged by the cold. They found the town in ruins. Roofs had collapsed under the weight of snow. Walls had buckled inward. Doors hung open on houses that had been abandoned when the fuel ran out. The cattle that had died were buried beneath drifts, invisible now but certain to create problems when the spring thaw came. The church still stood, more or less. Its steeple had snapped off and lay half buried in the snow. The windows were broken, the door hanging open, and inside in the sanctuary that Reverend Crane had tried to defend with faith alone, there was only cold and silence. They found his body on January 4th, during the systematic search of every building. He was seated in what had been his chair at the front of the church, wrapped in the frozen altar cloth, his face peaceful in a way that it had never been in life. The Bible in his hands had fallen open to a page in Proverbs. "Pride goeth before destruction," someone read aloud, and a haughty spirit before a fall. No one commented on the appropriateness of the passage. They wrapped the body in blankets and added it to the growing number of dead, who would need to be buried when the ground thawed enough to dig. The total count reached 38, 33 who had died before and during the evacuation, plus 5 more who had either stayed behind or been unreachable. Among them was Dr. Edwin Mercer, who had survived the collapse of his roof and the breaking of his leg, but had succumbed to infection during the worst days of the storm. The man of science who had dismissed the Whitfield sisters' warnings had died believing in nothing except his own pain. 74 people had survived. Some were already talking about leaving, about finding somewhere else to build their lives. Others were determined to stay, to rebuild, to prove that they could not be defeated by a single catastrophic winter. But before any decisions could be made, there was something that needed to happen first. The gathering took place in the cleared space before the ruined church. It was the largest area available, and there was a certain appropriateness to holding this meeting in view of the building where so much wrong had been done. Aldrich Holloway spoke first. He stood before his neighbors, the people he had led and advised for 35 years, and he told them the truth. I stood in that church in September, and I called the Whitfield sisters liars. I said they knew nothing about Montana winters, that I did not know better. I helped take their land. I helped drive them into the wilderness. And every word I spoke was arrogance. Every judgment I made was blindness. I condemned them for knowing what I was too proud to learn. His voice cracked, but he continued. My son would be dead if not for them. My wife, my family, everyone I love would be frozen in the ruins of our home, if not for 2 young women that we tried to murder with our arrogance and our certainty. He turned to face Cora and Wren, who stood apart from the crowd, hatchet at their feet, Ember and Spark tethered nearby. I do not know how to apologize for what we did. I do not know if such an apology is even possible, but I want you to know that I understand now. I understand what we took from you, and I understand what you gave us in return. And I swear, on the graves of everyone we lost, that I will spend the rest of my life trying to be worthy of the mercy you showed us. Other voices joined his. Orville Tate, who had laughed when Cora first warned them, spoke of how he had burned his shelves and furniture and still nearly frozen to death. He apologized for his mockery and promised to share whatever he learned about survival with anyone who wanted to know. Clem Skaggs, the young man who had bet $5 that the cave would collapse, spoke of how he had been trapped with his family when their roof fell in, how they had nearly died in the cold, how he had realized in those desperate hours that his confidence had been foolishness dressed up as wisdom. He offered to work for the sisters for a full year, without pay, to begin making amends for his contempt. Catherine Holloway spoke of holding her dying son in her arms, of praying for a miracle, of the miracle that came in the form of 2 young women and a cave carved into a mountain. She wept as she spoke, and many in the crowd wept with her. Even Mrs. Prudence Ashford, who had gossiped and whispered and spread rumors about the wild Whitfield sisters, found words to say. She admitted that she had been cruel because she was afraid of anything different, anything that challenged her comfortable assumptions about how the world should work. She asked forgiveness, though she clearly did not expect to receive it. Through all of this, Cora and Wren remained silent. They listened to the apologies and the confessions, the promises and the pleas. They watched the faces of the people who had sent them to die, and then begged to be saved. When the testimonies finally ended, Cora stepped forward. She was not yet 20 years old, but she spoke with an authority that made age irrelevant. My father taught me that the mountains do not judge. They do not care if you are rich or poor, good or wicked, young or old. They only care about who is prepared and who is not. They only care about who listens and who refuses to hear. She looked around at the faces of the survivors. People are different from mountains. People judge. People fear what they do not understand. People silence the voices that make them uncomfortable. She paused, letting the words sink in. But my father also taught me something else. He taught me that people can change. They can learn from their mistakes. They can become better than they were. Her gaze swept across the crowd, meeting the eyes of those who had wronged her. I do not forgive what you did. Forgiveness is not something I know how to give. Perhaps it will come with time. Perhaps it will not. She took a breath. But I am glad you are alive. I am glad the children are alive. And if you want to learn what I know, how to read the land, how to prepare for what is coming, how to survive when the world turns cold, I will teach you. My father's knowledge will not die with me. It will spread to anyone willing to learn. Ren stepped forward to stand beside her sister. Our father used to say that the mountains have no mercy, but we do not have to be like the mountains. We can choose to be different. We can choose to help even those who have hurt us. We can choose to build something better than what was here before. She smiled, and it was the first genuine smile many of them had seen since the storm began. So let us start building. If you have made it this far in the story, I want you to know that your support means everything. Stories like this survive because people like you watch them all the way through and share them with others who need to hear them. If this story has touched you, please take a moment to leave a comment below. Tell me about a time when you were not believed or a time when you had to help someone who had hurt you. I read every single comment, and I would love to hear your story. The rebuilding of Elhorn Creek began that same week. It started with the Whitfield land. The property that Reverend Crane had tried to claim for the church was returned to its rightful owners. The Territorial Land Office, when they finally received the documentation that spring, found no irregularity in Josiah Whitfield's homestead claim. The rumors of improper filing had been lies, spread by a man who wanted what did not belong to him. Cora and Ren returned to Stonehaven, but they did not stay there alone. In the weeks and months that followed, a steady stream of visitors made the journey to the cliff dwelling. Families came to see how the cave had been constructed. Individuals came to learn the techniques that had saved their lives. Children came because their parents wanted them to understand what real preparation looked like. Cora taught them everything: how to read the signs that nature provides, how to identify the plants that can sustain life in winter, how to build structures that work with the environment instead of against it, how to store food and fuel for the worst-case scenario, how to listen when the animals are trying to tell you something important. By the spring of 1887, 23 new earth-sheltered structures had been started throughout the valley. Not caves like Stonehaven, but root cellars and storm shelters and reinforced outbuildings designed to survive whatever the weather brought. The people of Elhorn Creek had learned their lesson. The cattle industry, which had been the foundation of the local economy, was devastated. The great herds that had grazed the valley were largely gone, and those ranchers who wanted to rebuild faced years of slow recovery. Many diversified into other forms of agriculture. Others sold their land and moved away. Aldrich Holloway was among those who stayed. His herd had been destroyed, but his family had survived, and he discovered that family mattered more to him than cattle. He became one of Cora's most dedicated students, spending hours learning the skills that he had once dismissed as superstition. His ranch eventually recovered, but it was never again run with the arrogant certainty that had characterized his earlier years. Thorne Holloway became something more. In the months after the Great Winter, he found himself drawn to Stonehaven again and again. At first, he told himself that he was learning survival skills. Then he told himself that he was helping with construction projects. Eventually, he stopped making excuses and admitted the truth. He was in love with Cora Whitfield. She did not make it easy for him. She did not encourage or flatter or simper. She treated him exactly as she treated everyone else who came to learn, with patience and practical instruction and a complete absence of romantic nonsense. But she noticed him. She noticed his dedication, his willingness to work, his genuine transformation from the uncertain young man who had watched silently while injustice was done. She noticed the way he treated Ren with respect, and the way he played with Benjamin during the boys' visits, and the way he never complained even when the work was hard and the hours were long. In the spring of 1892, 5 years after the Great Winter, Thorne asked Cora to marry him. She refused. "I do not need to be rescued," she said. "I do not need a husband to complete me or protect me. I have survived things that would have killed most men, and I have done it on my own terms." Thorne nodded, unsurprised by her answer. "I know," he said. "I am not offering to rescue you. I am asking to stand beside you. There is a difference." Cora looked at him for a long moment. "Ask me again in the spring," she said finally. He asked her again in the spring of 1893, and this time she said yes. The wedding was held at Stonehaven, in the cleared area before the cave entrance where Cora and Wren had worked so hard to carve a home from living rock. The entire surviving community of Elkhorn Creek attended. Delphine Brennan, now 63, served as witness. Wren stood beside her sister, tears streaming down her face, happier than she had been in years. Hatchet, elderly now and gray around the muzzle, lay at Cora's feet throughout the ceremony. They did not leave Stonehaven after the wedding. Instead, Thorn moved in, joining the household that Cora and Wren had built. He learned to love the stone walls and the constant temperature and the sound of the spring gurgling in the darkness. He learned to read the weather signs and to trust the knowledge that Josiah Whitfield had passed to his daughters. He became, in time, one of the most respected survival instructors in the territory. But he never forgot that he had come to this knowledge late, and he never stopped being grateful for the second chance he had been given. Wren never married. She had no shortage of suitors, but she had discovered something that interested her more than romance. She had a gift with animals, an ability to communicate across species lines that seemed almost supernatural to those who watched her work. She became known as the horse whisperer of Bitterroot, a woman who could calm the wildest Mustang with a touch and a word. Ranchers from 3 territories brought her their difficult animals, and she rarely failed to reach them. Ember lived to the remarkable age of 27, and Spark produced foals that carried their mother's intelligence and their grandmother's fire-colored coat into the next generation. Wren had 47 students over the course of her life, young people who wanted to learn her methods. They spread across the American West, carrying her techniques and her philosophy to places she would never visit herself. Some of them became famous in their own right. All of them credited her with changing their understanding of what was possible between humans and animals. She lived in Stonehaven for the rest of her life, sharing the space with Cora and Thorn, and eventually with their children. She was the last to leave, outliving her sister by 4 years, outliving Thorn by 7. She died in the winter of 1941, at the age of 72, in the cave she had helped carve from living rock when she was 17 years old. Her final request was that she be buried beside her sister, in the small cemetery on the hillside where their parents rested. Hatchet had died in 1899, at the age of 16. For a wolf hybrid, this was extraordinarily old. He had spent his final years sleeping by the fire, occasionally rousing himself to greet visitors or to accompany Cora on short walks through the valley. He was buried at the entrance to Stonehaven, where he had stood guard for so many years, with a small stone marker that read simply, Hatchet, loyal friend and guardian. He kept watch so we could rest. Cora Whitfield Holloway died in the spring of 1937 at the age of 70. She passed peacefully in her sleep, in the bed that Thorn had built for them decades ago, in the cave that she had carved with her own bleeding hands when she was 19 years old. She had lived to see her children grow and her grandchildren born. She had lived to see the techniques she taught become standard practice throughout Montana. She had lived to see scientists from the University of Montana confirm what her father had known all along, that Earth-sheltered dwellings maintain temperatures between 52 and 58 degrees year-round, that such structures used 80% less fuel than conventional buildings, that the old ways had been right all along. In 1978, researchers from the university's architecture department conducted a formal study of Stonehaven. They measured temperatures throughout the year, documented the construction techniques, and analyzed the thermal properties of the sandstone walls. Their findings were published in a journal that few people outside academia ever read. But the conclusion was clear. The dwelling constructed by Cora and Wren Whitfield in 1886 represented a sophisticated understanding of passive climate control that predated modern environmental design by nearly a century. The principles they employed, learned from their father and from generations of mountain people before him, remain valid and applicable today. The cave still exists. It is protected now as a historical site, maintained by descendants of the students the sisters taught. Visitors come from around the world to see the carved chambers, the fire pit, the stable where Ember and Spark once stood. They come to understand how 2 orphan girls survived what should have killed them and then chose to save the people who had tried to let them die. Above the entrance, carved in letters that Cora added sometime in the years after the Great Winter, is an inscription that visitors often photograph. The animals warned us. We warned them. Now all of us know. The people of Elkhorn Creek and their descendants never forgot the lessons of that terrible winter. The phrase listening to the animals entered the local vocabulary, spoken with quiet respect, meaning to pay attention to the signs that nature provides, to trust warnings that come from those who understand the land, to prepare for the worst even when the worst seems impossible. The Great Winter of 1886 to 87 killed more than 300 people across Montana Territory. It destroyed the cattle industry as it had existed, ending the era of the open range forever. It changed the way people thought about preparation and survival and the relationship between human communities and the natural world. But in one small valley in the Bitterroot Range, it did something else. It taught a community that wisdom can come from unexpected sources, that those who are cast out may be the only ones who can save us, that the mountain does not care about our pride, but we do not have to be like the mountain. We can choose to be different. We can choose to listen. We can choose to help even those who have hurt us. This is the legacy of the Stone Sisters of Bitterroot, not the cave they carved, though that still stands. Not the techniques they taught, though those are still practiced. Their legacy is something larger, something that lives in the hearts of everyone who hears their story and recognizes something of themselves in it. Because who among us has not been silenced when we tried to speak truth? Who among us has not been dismissed by those who thought they knew better? Who among us has not had to choose in a moment of crisis whether to help the people who hurt us or to let them suffer the consequences of their own actions? Cora and Ren chose mercy. They chose to teach instead of punish, to build instead of destroy, to give instead of take. They chose to be better than the circumstances that created them. And in doing so, they carved not just a home in the stone, but a place in history that will never be worn away. Thank you for watching this story of the Stone Sisters of Bitterroot. If their journey of resilience and quiet vindication moved you, I hope you will share it with someone who needs to hear it, someone who has been silenced, someone who has been dismissed, someone who is still waiting for the world to recognize what they knew all along. Subscribe to this channel for more stories of frontier courage and the triumph of wisdom over arrogance. And please tell me in the comments, has anyone ever punished you for telling a truth they did not want to hear? How did you find the strength to keep going? The mountains are patient, and so is truth. Both will still be standing long after pride has crumbled to dust. The end.